Okay. So thanks to everybody for coming to this panel on consuming sustainability. So my name is Jose Johnston, and I will be speaking first. Then we'll hear from Sean Bauman, Emily Hutter-Kennedy, and Norma Kendrick. Dietland is unable to join us today, unfortunately. So we'll try to keep our remarks fairly brief, and then we will open up the discussion to, or open up the floor to discussion. So most of us in the room are familiar with this idea of eating for change or voting with your fork. Consumers are increasingly encouraged to see their individual food choices as political acts. By voting with your fork, you, the consumer, have the power to influence social and environmental change. And there's been a lot of debate in scholarly circles about the pros and the cons of this kind of strategy. Some wonder whether voting with your fork can actually bring about meaningful change. But on the other hand, voting with your fork is a relatively accessible strategy. It can be easier to buy a bag of organic carrots, for example, or some wild salmon, rather than go to get all the energy that is required to go and attend a march or a protest. On the other hand, scholars have pointed out that these kinds of shopping philosophies can deflect attention away from the substantive changes that are required to move us towards genuine environmental sustainability. Focusing on organic carrots might make you feel good, but some people say it's a little bit like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It may make you feel good for a moment, but then you look at the broader picture and things don't look quite so good. An individualized politics of voting with your fork can also work to valorize the shopping practices of white, affluent shoppers, while condemning the shopping practices of less affluent and racialized eaters. When I looked online the other day, I saw that shopping at the farmer's market was number 5 on the list of things white people like. As it says on the slide, white people are known for their love of local economies, being outdoors, and their passion for sustainability. So I'm gonna just bracket the class and race issues for just a moment. Because my focus in this talk here today is really on gender and what gender means to discussions about consuming sustainability. And I've deliberately used this stock photo here that's called Happy Young Woman at the Farmer's Market, and it can be found alongside Happy Woman Eating Salad photos. And I used it here because I think that neglecting gender is a striking oversight, given that women continue to perform the vast majority of the everyday food work within the home. The idea of caring through food continues to be powerfully linked to our collective imaginary around what femininity means. And this topic was the topic of a book that I co-authored with Kate Cairns. And in that book, we documented how women's identities are still powerfully connected to their food work. So to demonstrate this really powerful connection between food and femininity, I just want to encourage you to do a kind of thought experiment. So imagine a woman who doesn't seem to care about food, and then consider all the social judgments that might follow. So think of a mom who might send her kid to school with a prepackaged lunch, like a Kraft Lunchable, or a mom who's seen feeding her kids hot dogs or processed food. Or consider who gets blamed when a child is overweight. So what all these examples show is that failing at food also means failing at femininity. On the other hand, succeeding at food gives women a real sense of pride and accomplishment and admiration from others. So imagine, in contrast, the woman who buys organic carrots and then makes her a pureed baby food at home instead of buying a jar of baby food at the store. Or think about a mom who serves her healthy, thin children a sustainable lunch of lentil soup and like locally picked apples. So in our research, we found that succeeding at food not only means providing healthy, locally sourced, delicious food for your kids, but it also means providing sustainable food. So the successful feminine subject uses food to protect her own health and well-being and her body shape, but she also uses food to care for her family members, but she also uses food to care for the planet. So in my remaining time here today, I have 2 questions that I'd like to address. The first question is, how is food politics gendered? And so I want to talk a bit about how gender plays out in my own work research on women in food politics. And then the second part is I'd like to briefly address what I think are 3 points in a feminist consumer politics or food politics. And when I say food politics, I'm using that term as a shorthand for struggles to create a food system that's more socially just and sustainable, and all the power struggles that are implicated in that. So question 1, how is food politics gendered? So in my research with Kate Cairns, we found that food politics was gendered in several ways. The first way that it's gendered is in terms of who shoulders the burden for doing the food work. And it was typically in our research, we found that it was typically women who took on the extra labor that was required to go to the farmer's market, to haul the food home on your bike, to find the locally sourced butcher who deals with sustainable meats. That was often the work that women were doing in the household. So given this added food labor, we've also found that the consumer food politics extended the gendered care work that was already going on in the home and that women have historically performed. So women today are expected to not only care for their bodies and themselves, but they're also expected to care about the planet and care about the planet via their sustainable food choices. And women in our study actually responded fairly positively about that. They said that the food work that they were doing was part of the efforts that they themselves were invested in caring for the planet. And they described their ethical eating and ethical food work as an act of caring for animals, caring for local farmers, caring for the atmosphere. And many respondents described how doing this care work felt like an everyday act of politics. They talked about how they felt really powerless in the larger corporate food system, and that buying local foods or buying sustainable foods gave them a sense of meaning and a sense of control. So here's a quote from Fran. She says, "There are people I want to give my money to. There are a lot of other people I don't want to give my money to, and that's something I can have control over, and that's the way I exercise it." So for women like Fran, deciding where to buy and who to buy from is a political act, and they saw it as a way to make positive change for both for animals, society, and the environment. And I think from a feminist perspective, it's important not to dismiss this gendered articulation of political agency. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that this kind of care work is not always easy, and also it's not always accessible to everybody. This kind of everyday activism requires a kind of financial security that a lot of women and mothers don't have. So constructing food system concerns as the private concerns of individual consumers also can generate material and emotional costs for women who feel responsible for addressing systemic issues through their everyday life choices. So this requires time, energy, money, and it also requires a lot of emotional labor. It requires emotional labor to manage the eating practices of people in the household. So not all family members, especially kids, get excited about eating locally sourced greens cooked in bone broth, or eating less meat for the sake of the planet. Ethical food work can be tiring, and it can be off-putting to others. People describe getting into arguments with their partners or their kids. They describe feeling frustrated when their partners would buy packaged foods as a shortcut or question the validity of why they were buying organic foods for their kids. One male partner in one interview, he rolled his eyes when his female partner described how she was emotionally anguished in the egg aisle of the supermarket. She said, "I'm looking at these eggs, I'm trying to figure out which one is good for the chicken, which one is good for the planet." And he's basically openly mocking her for caring about those kinds of details. When another respondent asked the waiter at a restaurant where the meat was sourced from, her husband said, "Deirdre, please, for God's sake, don't do that here." And she told us the story, and it was funny, but later she talked about how much work she had to do to take on the job of eating locally sourced sustainable food for the household. She had to do a lot of planning work, and she basically had stepped away from the paid workforce to do this kind of work in her own home to enable the rest of the family to eat ethically. She said, "I had to stop talking the talk and start walking the walk, and cooking things here at home was a lot easier more often than I was. I was very much a convert. I only ate the good stuff myself. My husband was eating out at different restaurants, but he now packs a lunch every day that she makes. And he's able to do it because he has me here cooking." So the takeaway point here is that gender politics matter a lot in determining which households are able to carry out ethical or sustainable food work. So besides those individual consumer politics dimensions, we also found a collective dimension. So besides just interviewing everyday women about their food habits, we also interviewed female food activists. And in these activist interviews, we observed that a common theme was the goal of moving beyond individual choice as the main or the only tool to achieve sustainability and looking more at the realm of collective politics. So here's a quote from Lauren. She says, "I think it's true that food is still primarily the realm of women and social reproduction. And women are often drawn into this work from that angle and from a community organizing and food provisioning angle. So this might seem like a natural extension, going from the kitchen table to the community kitchen table, so to speak. But women food activists also pointed to an inequitable gender division of labor within this realm of food activism. So our interview with Lauren suggested there's a need for careful gender analysis within the realm of food politics. So in brief, frontline food security activism was coded feminine, while the realms of policy and food production and food expertise were coded masculine. So while community level food work tends to be dominated by women, in the policy realm, and especially on the agriculture side, the discussion tends to be dominated by men. And Lauren pointed to her own work as a food policy activist and said, "I go to a lot of meetings where I'm the only woman under 50, and it's all men in suits." So I think it is striking too when we think about who are some of the most notable champions of the ethical or sustainable food movement. We often hear people mention Michael Pollan or Mark Bittman, sorry. So in contrast, many of the people who are doing this frontline work, volunteering in food banks, are often women. Okay, moving to my second question. What would a feminist food politics or sustainable food politics look like? So given that women continue to be the primary shoppers, planners, and cooks within most homes, I'm pretty convinced that shedding light on the work of sustainable food politics is profoundly a feminist issue. So given these gender dynamics of everyday food work and of green consumption, I think it's important and useful to ask the question, what would this feminist politics look like in a perfect world? What were some lodestars? So here I'm drawing from a conversation with my co-author, Kate Cairns, who's not here today, but we came up with this in a conversation about 3 points that we think are essential. And I don't put these forward as these are like the ultimate points that need to be, written into a stone tablet, but more just jumping off points for conversation. So the first point is that a feminist food politics must respect the personal, but also look beyond the dinner plate. So a key component of feminist struggles involves valuing the lived experiences of women and unpacking the political implications of those lived experiences. So that's really what, the second wave feminists meant by that phrase, the personal is political. Attention to women's joys and struggles is critical to an expanded conception of consumer or sustainable politics that involves everyday issues like the struggle to get a healthy, tasty, ethical dinner on the table. At the same time, a politics that only works at the level of the personal is not enough. We need to value the personal, but also retain a connection to broader issues of social inequality, racism, heteronormativity, and sustainability. And these factors all limit the potential for many eaters to move towards a more sustainable diet. And that brings me to point number 2. A feminist food politics should value collective struggle, but still care about what goes on the plate. In our interviews, we found that a lot of women felt judged for their love of cooking and the pleasure that they find in food work. So whether it's accurate or not, some women perceived a judgmental feminist gaze looking on them and shaming them for the pleasure that they found in their food work. So we argue that a feminist food politics should promote the idea that cooking dinner isn't retrograde, it's not an embarrassment, but it can be considered a potentially transformative act and a feminist practice, and a practice of sustainability. So here I'm going to quote Toronto food activist and really icon Debbie Fields. She said in an interview with us, "I don't think I have to boycott home cooking as a feminist. I think, in fact, I can urge my brothers to join me." So point number 3, a feminist food politics should work to build a politics that is inclusive, critical, and avoid sectarianism and be intersectional. So there remains a curious absence, or at least underestimation, of gender issues in many streams of food scholarship, and also I think in sustainability scholarship as well. We need to make sure that gender is addressed at the dinner table and the policy table. At the same time, a feminist politics has to go beyond just adding an add gender and stir approach. We need an intersectional approach that looks at how food and consumer politics intersects with race, class, and other systems of oppression. So that means asking difficult questions, questions that often make people feel uncomfortable, questions like, who has the creativity, the care, and the resources to cook up a sustainable dinner? Who knows how to prepare a dinner that is nourishing and delicious, especially on a restricted budget? And who is able to consistently choose foods that are sustainable, non-exploitative, and good for the planet? And if the answer to these questions are mainly women, or mainly rich white women, then I think a feminist food politics has more work to do. And that's the end of my remarks. Thank you. So if it's okay, I think we'll hold questions to the end to have a more fulsome discussion. So I'll hand the mic to Sean Bauman.
No, could I have him here? Okay. Thank you for coming today. My name is Sean Bauman. I'm in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Toronto. Today I'm going to present on research that's the data collection is done, but the analysis is in progress. It's part of a larger project that I'm engaged with Jose Johnston, who you just heard from. And in some of this project, we're also working with another of the presenters, Emily. And so as the analysis is ongoing, I am actually very interested to hear any of your thoughts or questions today. Okay, so it's an intentionally provocative title, The Transformative Potential of Eating Meat, in response to the, what seems to me, enormous amount of negative coverage of the meat industry recently. So how can something that's so destructive have transformative potential? So that's kind of the issue that I want to investigate, how people think that can be true. And so, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of negative attention directed towards the meat industry recently on account of it being extremely resource intensive. It produces a lot of greenhouse gases, so it's contributing a lot to climate change. It also involves the inhumane treatment of animals, exploitative labor practices, and produces a product that is negatively affects human health. In contrast, or so they would like to position themselves, the alternative meat industry, and here we're talking about alternative to industrial scale meat production, but not vegetable-based meat products. So alternative meat, small scale meat production is less resource intensive, treats animals more humanely, it produces less pollution depending on the methods employed. The meat that is produced is healthier for humans. It is friendlier to labor. It helps with rural development and is community oriented to have small business owners in rural areas. It produces a product that's more delicious, they claim, and is a more realistic option for society, which is comprised of many consumers who will not realistically be vegetarian. That's their perspective. So just to situate our interest in this topic, it's an interest in conscientious consumption more generally. So by conscientious consumption, that is the idea that there are ways to shop that can minimize harm to society and to the planet, or even save the planet. Within conscientious consumption, food is a very important consumption realm with a lot of influence because of the size of the food industry, and also because of the nature of food production. It definitely is closely linked to a lot of ecological issues. But at the same time, as I'll mention with critiques, it's a bit of a contradiction to consume and to be more sustainable, because consuming is what's getting us into into trouble in the first place. So conscientious consumption claims that consuming differently, so more ethically, more conscientiously, is better than consuming in the same conventional ways that are producing the problems that we see now. Within conscientious consumption, conscientious omnivores are a subset and it's a label applied to people who are choosing to eat meat more conscientiously, so with ethical issues in mind. There are clearly barriers to moving away from industrial meat. They include things like the industrial meat that we currently have is very cheap relative to small scale production based methods for producing meat. People have less knowledge about alternative meat, even though these things are changing, but clearly people don't know a lot about alternative meats. People don't always have access because small scale means that there is less availability of the products that they create. And people are stuck in their ways. They have routines, they have habits. They've done, most people have grown up eating meat, conventional meat, and they continue to do what they've always done. Even though alternative meat has been an option that is available for decades now, it's still a very niche market. It's not a large part of the meat industry. So what I want to focus on today is the concept of choice and how this is conceptualized by the alternative meat producers themselves. And consumer choice is a key issue in studying the relationship between consumption and sustainability, because consumers' choices are an important factor or important point in that relationship between the production of commodities and the eventual ecological harms that we're concerned with. At some point, consumers are making choices to purchase commodities that participates in a system of the creation of ecological harms. But how do we understand these choices? Well, on the one hand, we know that choices are influenced by certain things like structural constraints. Some of these are material, so budgetary, economic, or availability. Some of them are cultural, so the knowledge and the habit. But people also have, in addition, they're working with structural constraints, they also have agency. They have preferences and priorities. And so structure and agency are intertwined in consumer choice. Choices have consequences. That's why it's interesting, because when consumers make choices in large numbers and in enduring ways, there can be negative resource implications. And the environmental consequences of these choices are especially profound. So theorizing choice, we're making our choices within a larger cultural context of neoliberal ideology, where we have a pervasive cultural belief that individual choices are important for it is an important human right, it's important for our dignity, it's important for our identity. There's a lot of cultural support for the idea that our choices should be free and autonomous. There have been many academic critiques of consumer choice and the contradictions that are involved in reconciling support for consumer choices on the one hand with goals of ecological and social harm reduction on the other hand. And sometimes we can have the organization and the political will to have regulation address social problems by removing or limiting certain kinds of choices. So, famous example, we don't allow people to buy hard drugs because there's the social problem of addiction. So we have legislation there that removes that from the marketplace. Okay, so the research questions that we're looking at with this project, or at least this article that we're carving out of the larger project, how do alternative producers understand the nature of consumer choice? And how do alternative producers see the role of consumer choice in shifting away from industrial meat consumption? So we came up with these questions because we know that industrial meat producers embrace the supremacy of consumer choice. These large corporations that dominate industrial meat firmly believe that consumer choice has to be protected at all costs. They think that it is what people want and what people should have. So these alternative producers who are positioned in opposition to these big corporations might be expected to see things differently. So as I mentioned, this project is part of a larger project on meat production and consumption. I'm only going to be talking today about that part of the data that deals with alternative meat production. And we look specifically at beef, pork, and chicken as the largest components of the meat industry. So just to give you a very brief overview of the project, we did site visits and interviews with alternative meat producers and distributors, including farmers, butchers, and restaurateurs, 46 site visits and interviews with 72 people who are involved in alternative meat production and distribution. So interviews were between 30 minutes, so there were a few on the phone that were shorter, and up to 4 hours of interviewing and site visiting. And the producers come from Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. And we transcribed everything and coded it with software in order to start to look at patterns in the data. So this figure represents the analysis of their conceptualization of the relationship between consumer choice and industry transformation. And so I want to spend the rest of my time just expanding on each of these points. So the perception one is that consumers choose meat that reflects their values. So that's the starting point, is that there's this relationship that they perceive. And then they also have different beliefs that support these perceptions. So they believe that mainstream industrial agriculture deceives consumers, and they also believe that it is the role of alternative meat producers to educate and inform consumers. And then they perceive consumer choice of educated consumers as being more ethically oriented. So once you educate and inform consumers, then they will make different kinds of consumer choices. And that consumer choice in this way, this is their third perception, will be what drives market change. So I just want to show you how it is that these alternative meat producers perceive and believe these things. So with perception one, this quote exemplifies the kind of thinking that links consumer choices with values. So in this particular case, this farmer was perceiving that there are two main kinds of customers for the alternative meat that he produces. One of them values taste, and the alternatively produced meat is more flavorful. And one of them, the other group, is environmentally oriented and want to eat ethically based on environmental grounds. So I'll just mention that there were lots of different values that were linked to consumer choices. So a lot of the linkages were made with people who don't choose to eat ethically, that the word lazy was used, or take the easy way out. But they also did have a slight vague recognition at times that sometimes people were thinking about their budget. So there was a little bit of recognition of structural constraints, but it was infrequent and kind of dismissed, and much more emphasis was put on the relationship between the values that people hold and the consumer choices that they make. Oh, right. So that was what I just said in this slide. Next one. All right. Belief number one. So, okay, so that was the first perception. And this belief is that consumers are deceived by industrial meat producers. So they believe that the situation is that consumers don't have the right information, in part because the meat industry is misinforming them. With a lack of transparency, they don't show them what is actually going on in terms of the conditions under which animals are raised and slaughtered, and they're also not providing the information about how environmentally harmful those methods are. So that was one of their beliefs about what the scene looks like. And another important belief is that small-scale producers are the people who then have to step in and take on the role of educators. So when we would ask them questions like, so where will the change come from? What do you see has to be done? The most common answer that we got back is, well, we've got to do it. People would talk about being at farmers market and talking to consumers, using social media, using farm visits, any way that they could possibly communicate with consumers in order to tell them the information that they would need to understand the differences between industrial meat and alternative meat. So what we got to do is we got to be people like ourselves, just go out, show that there is an alternative, give them the information they need. So they perceive consumer choice under those conditions to be different, that if consumers were informed, that they would be much more likely to choose alternative meat. So with this person who produced alternative meat and used media production methods in order to communicate with consumers, it was his belief that once you learn about it, that you would then act in a more socially caring way, in the same way that he would expect anybody who had the right information would consume differently about any other product, so they would about meat as well. So this was a very common perception that if people have the right information, that then they will make different consumer choices. And so then the third perception was, once they have the right information and this tendency, that then we can locate power for transformation in the hands of consumers. So the vast majority of the people that we talk to put a high degree of faith in consumer choice to make positive change in the meat industry. This was the #1 place in response to our question about where change will come from. This is the #1 response that we got. And significantly, they conceptualized these choices as individualized choices. They did not think that consumers should somehow act cooperatively or in a coordinated way to make collective action efforts in order to make change. Instead, these were still individualized consumer choices that each person would make, and then collectively, but individually, so cumulatively, change would come from each individual acting alone. So an example of this is, in this example, we asked specifically, well, what could the government do? What kind of legislation might be proposed? And then so this person said, the government really is only going to respond to consumers anyway, so really it all comes back to consumers. And eventually uses the actual phrase that consumers need to vote with their dollars. This was frequently referred to. So vote with your dollars was kind of a mantra amongst these alternative producers. So just to sum up what it is that we found in our reflections about the prevalence of the consumer choice model of industry transformation, we can see that consumer sovereignty is really a prevalent schema. They weren't articulating this, but we could see that they were employing the schema. Even among alternative meat producers, when you might expect that they, being in opposition to big ag, might see things quite differently from big ag on this issue. But no, instead, they were clinging to the same neoliberal idea of an individualized market solution to this social problem. It was also a bit of a contradiction for us, or it was a surprising contradiction, because producers themselves face barriers to change that were not subject to choice. So for instance, they have trouble scaling up, and that's related to public health regulations that would then prevent them from just choosing to do things differently. They also face practical constraints in scaling up in order to produce more for market demand, because once they scaled up, they actually had to compromise on the ways that they were doing things more ethically. So they were losing the very purpose of why they were doing things differently in the first place if they tried to scale up. So that despite having that kind of problem with just choosing to do things differently, they still expected consumers to choose that way. And it's also surprising because farmers are traditionally a group who has benefited a lot from coordinated mobilization. The agricultural system involved, and still does involve a lot of coordination between farmers and also between farmers and the state. But they were still reluctant to contradict the imperative of individual choice. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. So I want to take a step back from looking at people's practices and think a little bit more about relationships that we have to the environment. So the project that I'm going to talk about today is part of a larger project, but what I'm focused on today is trying to understand, well, two things. First, when we talk about green consumption, what sort of a relationship to the environment is that? And second, and related, what other relationships are there to the environment that might be being eclipsed by our society's focus on green consumers as agents of change? This is a project that I initiated while I was at Washington State University. I see Scott Frickel there, who was also there at one point, which is relevant, I promise. So a very brief history of how we study environment, human-environment relationships. WSU, Washington State University, is located in southeastern Washington, in Whitman County, the dark blue part. On the west side of the state, you have all the major urban centers, Olympia, the state capital, Seattle, Washington, and then just over the southwest part of Washington, you have Portland, Oregon. So the east part of the state, once you pass the Columbia, is very sparsely populated and largely based on the agricultural industry. Apples are produced in the central part of the state, and wheat grows in the eastern part of the state. This is a picture of Pullman. But why is this relevant? You are all fairly asking. Well, this is also arguably where environmental sociology began. Riley Dunlap, Bill Catton, and others at WSU in the 1970s were really struck by this juxtaposition. On one hand, the farmers around Pullman burned their fields as part of an agricultural practice in the fall, leading to really bad air quality, and what Catton and Dunlap saw as putting profit ahead of a care for the environment and human health. At the very same time, for the first time, youth were starting to organize Earth Day protests. And so nearby in Spokane and in cities all across the state, there are these progressives talking about their care and concern for the environment. And this is really the juxtaposition that is embodied in this, what is now well known in environmental sociology circles, so apologies for the non-environmental sociologists, as the new environmental paradigm. Basically, this is this scale that measures how much we care about the environment. And on the one hand, you have this, what they call human exemptionalist paradigm, that they felt captured this spirit of being, in their words, anti-ecological, more concerned about profit than the planet. And on the other hand, the new environmental paradigm, which they saw as this evolved and morally good relationship to the environment. These extremes inform this NEP scale that represents to this day how environmental sociologists and environmental social scientists in general measure environmental concern. So the argument that I'm making is that this framing is too simplistic and that it also entrenches the scholar's own worldviews into their measurement constructs. So to connect this point to our panel on green consumption, I want to make two subpoints. First of all, I think that the way we measure pro-environmental practices also is a reflection of this tendency to operationalize a consumption-focused orientation to the environment as the best one, the right one, the good one. So these are the 6 items that are on the General Social Survey and really used in all sorts of survey research to measure whether people are actively engaged in environmental protection. You can really see from quickly scanning these that consumption is a very strong focus of these practices. Second, just to remind everybody, these practices are strongly correlated with the NEP. So if you are highly concerned about the environment according to the NEP scale, you are highly engaged in those practices. And then we know from survey data that educated, liberal, white-collar people are the people most likely to be concerned about the environment along the NEP scale and engaged in these pro-environmental practices. And as you can probably tell from José's paper as well, this really is reproduced in the food world as well. But what other relationships to the environment might exist? Basically, I'm arguing that when we conceptualize human-environment relationships in the environmental social sciences, the majority of our scholarship reflects the worldviews of green consumers and validates their practices. Because we've taken this relationship to the environment largely for granted, I think, first of all, we don't really understand what it, dang it, that wasn't supposed to do that, sorry. It means that we don't really understand what green consumption is actually about in terms of a relationship to the environment, and we overlook other relationships to the environment. And as far as I know, there's no systematic attempt to actually document a more diverse array of human-environment relationships, which is what I'm trying to do. So then, not surprisingly, my first question is what human-environment relationships exist? I will just add the caveat that this is not all human-environment relationships in the entire world, but quite situated, as you'll see, coming out of these data that I collected in Washington State. And what sort of human-environment relationship is green consumption reflecting? And then how are these diverse human-environment relationships socially patterned? So do we see patterns across class, gender, politics, etc.? And then I have this additional agenda that I probably shouldn't incorporate for time reasons, but couldn't help myself, which is this question of whether things that aren't the NEP green consumer, are they really anti-ecological? Is that farmer burning a field really anti-ecological? Okay, so I won't talk too much about the data and methods, but if anyone wants to talk about it after in the question and answer, go ahead. But I conducted 64 interviews in Washington State, and I tried to sample rural and urban cluster or towns, and get a mix of conservative and liberal participants and a wide range of socioeconomic status. The data set is very white because the communities I sampled were very white, so that's a limitation. I really can't speak to how race contours the patterns that I'll talk about. And then I collected some pilot survey data. This N is 250, so don't take anything from the survey data very seriously, but I am starting a survey project that's representative and has a larger sample size. Okay. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. This is this model of human-environment relationships that came out of it. I realize now that white font is a terrible idea. So I will walk through it. It's kind of like picture a flow chart. So the first level is someone interested in the environment? Are they like keeping up on environmental news? Do they like nature? Is it just, I feel like, do they have an affinity for it? If not, I call them the peripheral. The environment isn't something that they're against, but they're like, it's kind of in the background. If yes, then you go to the next step. Is the environmental crisis that we all hear about on a regular basis something that they agree is really severe? Is this urgent? Is this monumental crisis? If not, I call these people the optimists, and I'll talk about them in more detail. If yes, then you go to the next step. Then do people feel this intense moral responsibility to lighten their own impact? Some people say no, and I call them the pessimists and or the structuralists. This is really a work in progress, so if anyone has alternative terms that they think are better, let me know. Let's just say yes, they're like, I care about I'm into the environment, this crisis is severe, I'm morally concerned about it, I feel this personal responsibility to reduce. Then how efficacious do they feel? Do they feel like they actually can do everything that they want to do? If not, I call them locked in. And if so, then they really represent this eco-habitus. So I'll use interview quotes to kind of flesh these out quite briefly. So the peripheral people, they're not very knowledgeable or interested in environmental issues. They're just passionate about other things. So this quote from Avery, who's a librarian in a small city, tells me, I'm just not too concerned. I feel bad about the ice cap and the polar bears, but I don't know. I wish maybe they would pass more laws, I suppose. So again, Avery's not opposed to environmental protection. She's not anti-ecological, but it's not her thing. It's just not the issue she feels most connected to. Then the optimists are people who are really passionate about nature, but they feel that people are exaggerating the extent to which the environment is in crisis. Bill is a really typical a person representing this. He's a realtor in a small town, and he's really passionate about nature. Like at times he sounded almost poetic, so he says, I'm a true supporter of the outdoors. So yeah, he said, it's a longing, it's a yearning. I really need to be out and have that connection. But when I asked him if he felt that the environment is in crisis, he said, I don't necessarily want to worry myself to death about the environment. When I think it's still going to be here when I die, when my kids die, when their kids die, you know, Mother Nature has a really weird way of working things out. So he sees nature as being very resilient, and he sees humans as being the major obstacle to a flourishing planet, and he takes this long view, like, when we're gone, the environment's going to recover. No judgment. Okay. Then the pessimists are people who are interested in the environment. They believe these issues are really serious, but they don't feel as individuals that they are morally responsible for resolving the problems. So Ted is a trucker in a small agricultural community. And he said, he thinks that people focus too much on little things when the bigger picture is there's so much going on. And I asked, what's the bigger picture? He says, I think dumping in the oceans is a big problem. I think cutting trees. I think some of it could be managed better as far as forests, conserving it a little better, but I don't think it matters what kind of toilet paper you buy. And then turning to the locked-in group, these are people who care deeply about the environment. They believe we're in a crisis. They feel they have a moral responsibility to reduce their impact, but they don't feel able to do that. And of all of the relationships to the environment, I think this is the most painful position to be in. So Cheryl, who is an out-of-work social worker in an urban area, said that she feels that she just doesn't consume sustainable products as often as she could or should. And I asked her how that feels, and she says, well, I feel like it's just another way that I'm not measuring up. My reach is exceeding my grasp. So it's a feeling of, oh yeah, that again. It's pretty familiar, the theme of this lifetime. And then last, we get to the very familiar category, who many of you are probably in this category. It's the person who cares deeply about the environment and believes we're in a crisis, feels that they have a moral responsibility to act, and feels like they do act on that moral responsibility fairly consistently. So I asked Nadine, who recently, where did Nadine come up? Sorry, there she is, who recently left a high-paying job to return to grad school to complete a PhD, what she thinks when she sees people buying local and organic products at the store. And she says, oh, that's what I do. Well, that's what I've been able to do. And I continue to do it, interestingly enough, in absence of money. It's weird. It just feels congruent. It just makes sense to me. Okay, so some very preliminary, very sloppy survey results that I'll run through very quickly. Basically, that those 5 categories are part of a nominal variable. And so I just broke them into 5 variables. And I'm just seeing to the extent to which social class, gender, age, politics inform or sort of are related to these different categories. And I'm borrowing from Sean's work using arts engagement as a measure of social class, which is good because it turned out to be very significant. So I think what I'm trying to point out here is that you can see that the ecohabitus is really the highest class category, and the peripheral is the lowest class category. And then you see these political contrasts and the extent to which people identify as optimists, or I identify them as optimists, or within this ecohabitus category. And then just really quickly looking at how these categories fit with the NEP kind of as expected, you see that the peripheral and the optimists would be categorized as anti-ecological, and the eco-habitus would be seen as pro-ecological. And then I also included boycotting and boycotting as sort of a measure of green consumerism. And again, not surprisingly, you can see the eco-habitus people are strongly correlated with both boycotting and boycotting, and the peripheral and the pessimists and the optimists have these negative correlations. All right, what does it all mean? So to return to the questions that are shaping this study, I've identified 5 relationships to the environment among my sample. I characterize green consumption as a relationship that's premised on an affinity for nature, perception that ecological crises are severe, a moral responsibility to protect the environment, and a sense of self-efficacy to do so. I note class contrasts between the peripheral category and the eco-habitus category, and political contrasts between the optimists and those with an eco-habitus. Finally, is anyone anti-ecological? I don't think so. I think that the peripheral people just don't feel like the environment is their issue, the issue that they really have much agency within, and that the optimists engage with a nature that is seen as distinct from humans and is local and immediate. And when they look at this epistemically near local environment, it looks like an environment that is flourishing. And so the idea of a global climate in crisis is epistemically distant. It doesn't resonate with their experience. So a couple of points that I'll make really quickly is, first of all, this broad argument that green consumerism is not the only relationship to the environment, and it's a somewhat polarizing one. That is, it's politically divisive. In quotes that I didn't share, the optimists describe feeling very misunderstood, judged, and frustrated by their exclusion from what they identify as mainstream environmentalism, to the extent that they feel like their children are coming home from school telling them that they're bad for the environment. They feel like their children, when they've gone to university, have been looked down on because they enjoy hunting and fishing. They really sense that they're perceived as anti-ecological, and they really bristle at that characterization. The eco-habitus is also socially divisive. As Nadine's quote illustrated, people with this relationship to the environment characterize their tastes as natural and effortless, leaving those who lack a taste for green but wish they didn't feel like it's just another way that they're not keeping up. And I want to thank the research assistants who helped me collect data, and people who gave me feedback at various points, and the money. That's it. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think my face is blocking the title, but the title of my presentation is Consumers Haven't Saved the World, so now what? So should we give up on consumer-driven or consumer-led change and go back to pressuring governments the way we used to in the quote-unquote good old days, if those even existed? So we know that consumers haven't really made a lot of difference. If we really zoom out and we look at the global patterns in consumption, extraction of natural resources, manufacture and production of chemicals, and especially if we think about things like the global circulation of contaminants and production of plastics, and the incorporation of plastics into our environment and the failure of recycling to do much about that. In fact, I could give you a laundry list of failures, environmental failures, that we could connect back to this broken promise of consumers as drivers of change. So in my presentation today, I don't want to give up on consumers entirely, but I want to present some other ways of thinking about consumer change using some models from what's happening in the United States, which is where I've done some of my research on something I call precautionary consumption. Oh, there's just another depressing picture for you of waste, landfills. So as consumers, we were promised that if we would just take part and agree to take part in this simple swap, that we would be able to change the world, or we would at least be able to create a cleaner world. This is something I call precautionary consumption, which involves reading a product label, learning about the ingredients in either a food or personal care product or consumer product in order to make the best choice. Noting, and this is significant, that these products have gone through ostensibly some sort of filtering process before they get onto our store shelves, which, as it turns out, that process is very, very loose and practically non-existent, I would say, in both Canada and the United States. So as consumers who want to keep their bodies so-called clean and free of chemicals, we've been encouraged to engage in this simple swap or precautionary consumption. So don't buy the Dial soap with triclosan, buy this, well, I don't even know what that's called, Branch Basics Ecological Soap. Really just exchanging one basket of goods for another. And as Jose pointed out in her early comments, the burden for making this simple swap really has fallen to mothers. And this is something I write about in my research that I've undertaken in the United States and New York City, specifically looking at mothers across social class backgrounds and racial and ethnic backgrounds to show that mothers across these diverse positionalities are all concerned about chemicals going into their kids' bodies and into their own bodies. And this concern is heightened during either like the preconception phase, but especially pregnancy, breastfeeding, and introducing first foods to children. And as you see here from Kanitha is a middle-class mother of 2 children. She's South Asian, and she talks about using her shopping as a form of precaution. So she's looking at product labels, she's reading ingredient lists, and she's trying to get the bad stuff out as best she can. And this quote, this is from Fiona. Fiona is also middle class, but she has a very limited income. She's in fact an adjunct professor. So she's highly educated. She has a great deal of cultural capital, but her economic capital is fairly limited. And she talks about buying her children organic food, but she and her husband don't eat organic food. And this is a cost management strategy. So we know that precautionary consumption, green consumption, it's expensive. But it's not just the expense I found, it's the time. And in fact, someone like Fiona who has a flexible work schedule, she may not have a lot of money, but she has a flexible work schedule, and she can go to multiple stores and she can find the most affordable, green, chemical-free, organic foods to feed her child. And she can also take the time to craft these 2 very different diets. One made up almost entirely of conventional foods for she and her husband, and the other for her child, which is mainly certified organic foods. So it requires a lot of time. Some mothers said that they enjoyed this process of reading labels and learning about what to buy, but for the most part, I found that mothers told me that this was very onerous and stressful, and they felt anxious, like they weren't doing a good enough job to protect their kids. So in my view, precautionary consumption has failed to really keep us free of chemicals. And if anything, even outside this case study of the mothers I interviewed in New York City, we can just think of it from an environmental justice perspective. In communities where most industrial production is happening, the impacts of that production is felt most acutely by Indigenous communities, communities of color, and low-income communities. So while New York City mothers may be doing their best and be completely well-intentioned in their organic consumption, we're not seeing a corresponding shift in toxic exposure in low-income and communities and communities of color. The other problem with precautionary consumption is that it has motivated among industrial producers something I call a toxic swap. So here are a couple of headlines to give you a sense of what this means. It means that as soon as consumers became concerned about bisphenol A or BPA, we saw BPA-free slapped on all kinds of plastic products. Indeed, these products were free of BPA, but they were made of something else, BPF and BPS, other bisphenol type compounds that are just as toxic, if not more toxic. And why? It's because those replacement chemicals went through the same broken regulatory system that their counterparts did. And we're seeing this also with Teflon replacement chemicals. So when you look at a frying pan that says that it's Teflon free or PFOA free, it's likely, unless they tell you what they're using, if they're using a nonstick compound, it's probably another perfluorinated compound, which in fact, we don't know what this chemical looks like because much of this information is still confidential under protecting industry innovation and industry secrets. So this simple swap within our current system, our current regulatory system, has failed. It's failed to protect vulnerable communities, and it's failed to protect even the most knowledgeable and well-intentioned consumers that might think that BPA-free is better and Teflon-free is better. So we've been duped. We've been fooled. However, how can you be optimistic with this terrible background? I remain somewhat optimistic. I think many people with environmental orientations tend to be optimistic. Why am I optimistic? I'm seeing a lot of social movement pressure in the United States at the state level. That means states like California or New York or Massachusetts or Washington State. And I see social movements putting pressure on these states, especially the more populous states like California, because if you can get California to pass really strong chemical regulation that affects only the state of California, what you'll find is that manufacturers and retailers will soon begin changing their practices because California is such a large and powerful market. And no manufacturer is going to make one product for the rest of the country and a different product for California. So I have a lot of hope in state level change, and California is a leader, as you can see from these quotes here. So this is the first quote is from Phil Landrigan. He's an environmental advocate, an environmental health specialist, and a pediatrician, and he talks about how when something happens in California, it spreads nationally when it comes to environmental health. Richard Dennison from the Environmental Defense Fund, which is an environmental social movement group in the US, says that decades of inaction at the federal level has led California to implement several toxic regulation acts and pieces of legislation, and these states are stepping in to fill the void. Policy evaluations coming out of California in terms of what California has done are fairly positive. There's still work to do, but this is not just simple state-led greenwashing. These are starting to make a small but significant difference. For example, flame retardants, so compounds that are put on our furniture and our electronics to keep them from bursting into flame. California was a leader in phasing these out, and we're starting to see these phase outs across the country. The other thing that gives me a little bit of hope, and this relates more directly to this theme of consumer-driven change, are campaigns like this one called Minding the Store. Minding the Store is a program of safer chemicals and healthy families, which is a coalition of hundreds of environmental and public health advocacy organizations in the United States. And they operate multiple programs, including this one. It's a program that pressures retailers to change their buying practices. In other words, to change what kinds of goods they're bringing in to sell to consumers. And what they do is that they work directly with major companies like Target, like CVS, Starbucks, Whole Foods Market. You can see all of the companies there. And what they do is they encourage these companies to come up with chemical policies to change what they're actually bringing into stores. And what I found in my research was that the shoppers who were the least stressed were the ones who could go into a store like a Whole Foods Market and feel like at least most of the things being sold inside the store were more or less safe, or at least a lot safer than the stuff that they would get at their conventional neighborhood supermarket. So it was saving them time and it was saving them stress. So what Mind the Store is trying to do is to make it so that when you go to a Target, which is a shopping space, or a Walmart, which are shopping spaces that are accessible to a wide range of people, so beyond that super educated middle-class consumer, that they're walking into a space where at least those products have been more carefully vetted, as this pressure is not coming from the federal government. So you can go onto their website and you can see how these different retailers rank. I can tell you that Target, they give them grades, and Target got an A, Apple got an A, Whole Foods Market got a B+ because they haven't phased in better packaging for their takeout food. Loblaws was ranked and it got a C+, and Yum Brands, which is Tim Hortons, got an F. So they're not doing well. But it's also, they're including like Tim Hortons and I think Kentucky Fried Chicken, and I can't remember who else and Wendy's. All right, so that second solution, I do see some promise here. So social movement pressure on retailers. Why are retailers responding? Well, they're responding in part because consumers are concerned about chemicals in the environment and in their bodies. So these previous campaigns that social movement groups have used to mobilize consumers to care about what they're eating and what they're buying have worked, and retailers are paying attention. But that alone hasn't been enough. And so groups that will actually work with these retailers to come up with better chemical management policies seem to be making a slight difference. It's still early in the game to really evaluate it, and I might be back here in a couple of years saying, no, sorry, that one failed too. But I'm going to try to be a little bit optimistic and just give you a couple of examples. So Mind the Store worked with Home Depot to phase out these perfluorinated, or they're called PFAS compounds, that are used on many of most carpeting uses it, because it's, when you buy a couch or carpeting that's stain resistant, it's using a PFAS type compound to keep that stain from settling into the fabric. So Home Depot just announced that they were going to phase all PFAS compounds out of their products. If Home Depot does this, many manufacturers are going to stop using these products or these compounds on the goods that they sell. So this is good news. A major grocer in the United States, I don't know if you've ever been to a Stop and Shop by Ahold Delhaize, they've promised to restrict some toxic compounds in food packaging and beauty products. And then the Mind the Store is working with retailers to develop a green chemistry program with retailers. That is to get them to think about green chemistry when they're thinking about what to buy and what to sell. And I think that this is really important because it's showing retailers the importance of green chemistry and the dangers of these kind of simple swap or these toxic swap compounds. So just to conclude, so social movement pressure works, and these are successful coalitions that we're seeing between local social movement groups, state level groups, and federal groups. And they bring together not just environmentally minded people, but also labor, health, and public health advocates. And retailers some at least, are responding to these changes. And this use of report cards kind of keeps retailers on their toes and keeps them honest to some degree. So consumer demand for greener and cleaner products is still important, because I think that's really the leverage that gives these programs some promise, but I think that in and of itself is not enough. And that's all I have to say about that, and I will. Thank you.
I have a question, mostly for Sean, but it actually relates to those findings from the last time as well. I'm from UC Davis, and the woman there in charge of the studies, and she's researching the processed food industry and their response to consumer changing preferences toward natural foods. She's found in some of their internal documentation that they've identified misinformation as a problem, similar to what you found with alternative meat producers. The processed food industry seems to think that people want natural foods because they're misinformed about the health and safety drawbacks of processed food. So I'm wondering if how the conventional meat folks think about this. Do they think that consumers are misinformed when they're switching to alternative meats?
So it might not surprise you to learn that they won't talk to us. And even so, the alternative people were often very wary because of so much anti-meat activism and criticism of the meat industry. So we tried a lot to get in touch with them. We wanted to do some site visits, just we need to educate ourselves about what they're doing. And that is exactly the kind of question that we would have liked to pose to them. And that, if I was imagining what they'd say without actually having talked to them, I would imagine they'd say, like, we're completely transparent and we never would ever mislead consumers, and we comply with every policy that's expected of us, and like those policies are insufficient. So I imagine that they see their efforts as being going above and beyond, but I mean, I can't point to any specific piece of evidence that would be a gotcha for them, but I think I'm sure somebody else has.
Blue shirt and then behind you, gray.
Sure. This is for Emily. So when you're defining the categories and then running through the fun stats with them, I was noticing that you didn't find any, at least in the stats you posted, there wasn't anything significant, statistically significant with what was it, the locked-in group, where with the context of the high self-sufficiency, efficiency kind of thing, as a person who perhaps might be most identifying with that framework, I was just wondering, is there any traits that are consistent within that? And also just when you were defining high self-efficiency, was that in the context of like specifically of individual action or in the ability of individual action more broadly in society? Because like those are kind of two different things.
Okay, so I have to admit that I was thinking about my answer to your first question when you asked your second question. Can you repeat it?
The
Second one.
In the context of the high self-sufficiency definition, is that understanding very specifically to the personal self, or in relationship to like individualized action at a broader level, individualized like consumer or?
Yeah, I get your question now.
Yeah.
So for the first one, there were only 14 people in that locked-in group in the survey. So that is why I think there was nothing significant. I should have survey results by December, and then I will have more to say about it. But from the interview data, the locked-in people were often people who had eco-habitus others sort of in their networks, whether it was at work or through their kids, friends, parents, but lacked the cultural capital to have kind of a taste for it. So often they had the same earning power as people who were in that eco-habitus group, but kind of couldn't bring themselves to fork out the extra money, or they were people in communities where it really was logistically difficult to be a green consumer. And so there were just too many logistical barriers. But what I found interesting about the locked-in group is they really didn't look to the structures making it more difficult to be a green consumer. They really felt guilt and shame themselves. On the second question, which I really like, I'd say that it was about self-efficacy in terms of having a natural taste for green consumption. But one of the difference between the pessimists or the structuralist and the other two categories to the right of that, so the locked in and the eco-habitus, is that the structuralists really doubted the power of individual environmental responsibility, whereas the other two categories felt that it was an effective solution,
but varied in the extent to which they personally felt they had the capacity to engage. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll take a few questions. I apologize, we started late, so we don't have a lot of time. Gray hoodie and then green shirt volunteer, and then black shirt, and then blue shirt.
Just more of a statement, Sean, you did a great job in your study, and I think meat is obviously on everybody's mind, beyond meat, if you will. Having said that, it's not really a question, but a statement. If not everybody has heard of this, but they probably should watch this. What the Health, and I think that will hit home in John's presentation. Something we seem to be observing is sustainability and climate change related to meat, but I haven't heard much people talk about the other crisis, our health. So if we're not here, it doesn't matter if the environment's good or bad at the end of the day. So, and one other interesting thing is that I wonder if we were to ever start planting little seeds or lobbyists, if you will, particularly in the U.S., to advocate a secret initiative that would infiltrate corporations on a young level, unlike myself, and perhaps slowly push the idea that how they can make more money, you're becoming green. So, for example, there's new industries that are created as a result of that. So maybe they're so headstrong, so focused on keeping people the same, eating meat continually. But if they were to learn that there was not only just economical benefits, social benefits, and obviously health benefits.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Just a quick response. I think that's why so many people were crestfallen at the latest studies that were promoting the idea that our prior knowledge about the health harms of eating meat were misleading, and that there actually wasn't enough evidence to say that there was. So now that there's even more confusion about the unhealthiness of meat, it'll be harder to do what you've just suggested.
I think Health Canada is even confused in some regards. So they're not very transparent, apparently, in their interviews.
Right.
Well.
Hi, I'm Roshni. I'm doing Master of Science in Sustainable Management at UP. So I was a little curious about anti-ecological. Is it with respect to the survey alone, or is it a gender perspective that there are no anti-ecologists? And if so, what are your thoughts on people burning black coal in terms of anti-sustainability movement? And I also have one more question for the first speaker with respect to food politics. If it's with respect to gender, then if you're looking to start young with kids, shouldn't both the parents be conscious irrespective of the gender? And if they're not going to have a female parent, if there are going to be two male parents or one male parent, how does it?
Right. Do you mind if I just get all the other two questions, and then we'll have, okay. I saw black.
So, hi, Leslie Dillman from Parsons New School. So my question, I mean, in the last year we've seen climate activism changing the discourse on climate change in ways that I think green consumption, only dreaming of doing this in the last couple of decades. So my question is, to some extent, maybe the focus and what we need to ask ourselves is, right, how do we get people to be more activist and to engage more rather than considering, how to get people to be more green consumers. So I'm wondering what's the difference there.
I have two questions. The first question is directly sort of like Sean. You mentioned in your presentation that I like how you're contrasting, like, yes, individual choices, individual consumer choices is important. However, we also need collective actions. And just wondering, can you elaborate a little bit on what kind of collaborative actions that you're thinking in terms of your study, and what are the concrete actions that is actually needed? The second question, I think, is more just to in general for all the panelists. I think the one thing that came across the presentation is this, and including Emily, I really like when we're talking about, all this pro-environment behavior is still very consumer-based. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on then considering all this power existing in the society, and we talk a lot about grassroots movement, and including a few weeks ago, this climate march in Montreal, and a lot of people start asking the question of, but how are these movements compete with the force of, for example, the lobbyists and those like existing dominant power?
Okay.
Basically, what's the entry point to deconstruct those?
Well, some great questions. So I have my watch as 12:31. So maybe I'll just ask the panelists to give a few last closing words. And
I think they said that we were going to eat into lunch.
oh, really? Okay. How far? Like how?
We started 15 minutes late, right?
Oh, just okay. So well, we'll still have brief responses, and then maybe we'll have time for more questions. So maybe we'll go. Can we go this way? So just, I don't know if I understood your question correctly, but I hope I wasn't implying that a feminist politics of sustainable food work would be women's responsibility. I don't think that's the case. I think of a feminist politics as something that would be that both all parents, single parents, parents in various situations would be responsible for. And I would also cite my a grad student I work with, Maren Olaschuk, who has done research on this topic, and she finds that there's a really pervasive and persistent idea that women should, or the kids should learn to cook from their mothers. Even when mothers often don't teach kids to cook and don't have time to teach kids to cook for many of the reasons that Nora said, and that most people actually learn to cook when they move out of their parents' house. So I think you can still have room for feminist food politics at various ages, but definitely including kids, but not downloading responsibility to women would be something that I think would be part of that agenda. Thanks for that question.
Well, the one, I guess I could respond to the question about activism, and I think that helps to explain maybe what's going on in certain states where there are more progressive environmental regulations, which is really where I would put most of my confidence in terms of seeing this more transformative structural change. It's electing people who are creating the legislation and then seeing it through. One thing I noticed about California with some of these bills that are designed to regulate toxic substances that go into our food and food packaging and consumer products is that they were passed very quickly. So that suggests that there's sort of a broad agreement that these policies are a good idea. So I still, even though Mind the Store, et cetera, are promising programs, it's regulatory change that's going to get us there, and it's who we elect that will make that change.
So following up from that, the kinds of collective action that are necessary are so definitely not the individualized consumer choices. Once people know, then they'll make. There's plenty of evidence that people know and still make the wrong choices. But so a social movement that's meat focused. So like Mind the Store is about getting toxic chemicals out of our products. But so a social movement that would be aimed at getting more ethically or alternatively small scale raised meat into our stores would be great. But even better than that would be a social movement that sought to achieve regulatory change, which would prevent the kinds of ecologically and with the ways of making meat that have low standards for animal welfare and negative environmental impacts would make those practices impossible to do. And there are countries where that's true. I think it's Denmark, right? So they don't need to have labels about like ethically raised pork because it's all done that way because they have legislation that just says that's the way to do it. And it turns out that all the pork gets to be more expensive, but that's not so bad because we are trying to discourage the level of consumption of meat anyway. So that kind of mobilization that would seek regulatory change would probably be what I would hope alternative producers would focus on more.
And I'm not entirely sure I understood your question perfectly either, but I will just say that the phrase anti-ecological comes out of Riley Dunlap and Bill Catton's original work when they were characterizing what this human exemptionalist or dominant social paradigm looked like. They said it's really a relationship where people put profit ahead of the planet. And I think that one of the problems with that is that the people who are putting profit first are people who are resource dependent for their livelihood. And so I think you see this unsurprising contrast where white collar knowledge workers are the environmentally concerned people and blue collar resource dependent workers are not. And I'm arguing that that doesn't reflect a lack of care or concern for the environment, but simply a different relationship to the environment. In terms of this question about activism and getting people more involved in social change, I don't have any answers. But I will say that I think that there's this, in the US context at least, and I haven't started doing interviews in Canada yet on this topic, but that there's this sort of chicken or the egg relationship. So what I found was that the people who are engaged in green consumption feel like you can't trust the government. They're either powerless or unethical and they're not going to do it, but that you can trust some factions of the market and that's really where we can have positive change. The categories of people who didn't feel like you could trust the market or the government is a bit of a fatalist, nihilist sort of relationship to the environment. And so I think thinking about Denmark, if you have a state that you can trust, then you don't necessarily need to be pursuing these market solutions, but to have a state that you can trust, anyway, right? I think I'm making sense. It's always my question. So basically the point being, I don't think it's on consumers to reform the market, but that as consumers, we're in a really tough spot where we don't trust governments to act to protect the common good. Like Nora's really juxtaposed the precautionary consumption with the precautionary principle, and yet so we're stuck navigating this complicated marketplace, doubting its effectiveness sometimes and feeling guilty for not being better consumers. Is there a happier note?
Well, as a consumer, I find it very difficult, challenging sometimes to navigate this marketplace and make sure that we are buying the best things. So nowadays we have like hot trending labels, natural, healthy,
Organic,
free, not to talk about cage-free, free range, whatever. And we know that most of the people, when they are shopping, they only look at the front of the package, right? And those labels are really deceiving because in the lack of some stronger policies on how they can label the products, you are just deceived because what they say is not really what the product is. Few people go to the back and read the fine lines and look at the ingredients. Even those who read the ingredients like me, most of the time, I don't really understand most of the products. So my question is, in the lack of the stronger policies on how to read the products, how we as consumers, we can protect ourselves, not feel that we are being taken advantage of by the company.
This is where I go back to you to vote with your vote and not with your fork. And it's true, it is so confusing to shop. And I'm always keeping track of these new claims that are coming out on our chicken, on our processed foods. And, I'm just astounded by it. And consumers they see two options. One makes many of these so-called health or clean label claims, and the other doesn't. And they're not stupid. They know that it's marketing, but it still seems slightly better than the one that has nothing on it. So they go with that one. And I don't think they feel entirely confident that their bodies are cleaner or they're going to be healthier as a result of these purchases. But they it's a gamble. Every shopping trip is a gamble. So I can't give anyone a set of practices or things that they can do. If I were to give out that advice, it would be for someone who had a great deal of flexible time and a lot of money and lived in the right place where they had really good access to certain kinds of foods. So I always go back to, we have to pressure our our elected representatives to represent this as a concern and to introduce legislation that addresses this specifically, rather than, you know, really kind of broad brush stroke like green legislation, but to talk about food and to talk about chemicals.
Thanks for all your presentations. I found them very fruitful. I'm Stephen Sharp. I teach environmental studies here at the University of Toronto. And this is more of a comment. I just kind of see us now in a diminished space. And part of it is the retreat by our governments at the federal level of protecting the common good. And I think of Rachel Carson, and when she testified in front of the U.S. Senate, and the role and support she got from the Kennedy administration to ban DPT. It seems now that, to quote Habermas, there's been a kind of colonization of our life world by a corporate way of doing our living, our life way. And with that, the common good is not necessarily the top agenda item for a corporate life way. And so I'm just wondering, in your perspective, in terms of this debate between individual consumption choice, public advocacy, and the role of government in protecting the common good, where do you see this landscape? And if it is related to a kind of diminution of the power or presence of our elected officials to even see themselves as protectors of our common health?
It's a hard question, and it's not one that's going to take us out the door on a happy note. So thanks for that. Do you want to speak about our paper on the collective imaginary? It actually is the negative answer to your question about the food activists that you interviewed and the idea of the collective imaginary, the political imaginary.
Yeah. So Jose and I interviewed food activists across Canada, and one of the ways that people measure how, or kind of conceptualize how robust a civil society is this idea of a democratic imagination. And they talk about thickness or thinness of the democratic imagination. So a thick democratic imagination is like, we're presented with that question and we've got all these ideas going off and we're bent, like we don't have this feeling of like, but it's like, oh, well, we could do this and we could do this. And so when we interviewed people in the food world, they had this really thick diagnosis of all of the problems that we're facing and very thin prognosis for what we can do in response. So they were really just talking about consumer-based choices in response. So there's all of these problems and we can buy local fresh tomatoes. So I think it is sort of the sign that there is a winnowing of our sense of capacity to contribute to the common good and trust that more powerful actors are concerned with the common good. There was this sort of general sense that the state had stepped back and that the larger market, you know, corporate capitalism was controlling the state and the majority of the market as well.
Mm-hmm. The one positive counterpoint to that I can think of is the recent interest in socialist politics in the US and more interest in Green Party politics. I think those are some positive notes where people haven't given up on the state yet and are trying to move beyond and are seeing the limitations of an individualized consumer politics approach. I don't know, maybe you live in the US, maybe you want to, do you want to say maybe I'm just dreaming?
Well,
like with the Green New Deal?
Yeah, like the Green New Deal seems to be getting some support, but I'm also seeing that being labeled as a socialist plot. So I don't know. I want to believe that could bring in a really diverse coalition of actors to support more structural change. But if it's labeled as socialism, which is, as I've learned, a very dirty word in the United States, then I don't know. But I would say, in terms of the common good, that many of the like key corporations and elected officials that are promoting sort of a business as usual model would say that they're promoting the common good, but they've reframed it in this very neoliberal way. We're maximizing consumer agency and consumer change, and common good is everyone has jobs, full employment, et cetera, et cetera. So I think they would say that they are promoting the common good, but in this very neoliberal way of looking at it.
Okay, so thanks for a great session. Thanks for coming out.